Okay, this is part 1 of our unit 4 on cognition, and in this lecture I will be discussing the organization and function of memory. So if we take the information processing model as our starting point, we can discuss how humans perceive, recognize, encode, store, and retrieve information. We are using the term information in a very broad sense because, as we know, memory is not just about retrieving individual bits of data. For example, many of you probably know how to ride a bike. Perhaps it's been a year or more since you last rode a bike, but if asked to do so again, you probably could. None of us can really recall specific bits of data that help us to do this, but our continued ability to ride the bike is still a function of memory. We can better clarify this by breaking memory down into 3 systems: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So if we talk about memory as a system of encoding, storage, and retrieval, the first step, of course, is how do we get the information in there to begin with. The first step in the memory process is the sensory register. Our conscious mind is being continuously bombarded with information. All of the visual information that is currently reaching your visual system, for example. And if you think back to our unit on sensation and perception, you will recall that the primary sensory systems receive all of the stimuli, and it is up to other neural processes to filter that stimuli into what is important and meaningful. And as you may recall from the brain unit, the reticular formation plays a large role in determining what stimuli make it through to conscious awareness. Interestingly, we have a level of memory available to us that precedes this filtering, allowing us to briefly recall information that we did not consciously process. Each sensory system has its own sensory store or sensory register, which receives and briefly holds all of the stimuli that it receives. The sensory register stores sensory information long enough for unconscious processes to analyze it to determine whether the input should be brought into working memory or discarded. Our visual sensory register maintains information for a few tenths of a second, allowing us to close our eyes and briefly maintain the image of what we last saw. We refer to this brief visual memory as iconic memory. So what color crayons did you see? How many were there? You could probably see 7 different colored crayons, but after a very brief period of time, you probably could not recall exactly what colors were there. Iconic memory lasts only a brief few tenths of a second before fading. Echoic memory is the distracted student's best friend. Perhaps you have had this experience where you are being distracted by a talkative peer and the teacher calls you out by asking, hey, what did I just say? And surprisingly, you can repeat back exactly what he said despite the fact that you are not paying attention at all. This is thanks to your echoic memory, which is a function of the auditory register. The auditory stimulus remains in the auditory system for a few brief seconds before fading. Had the teacher asked, what did I say 10 seconds ago, you probably would not have been able to tell him. Once the stimulus has passed through to the sensory register, or through the sensory register into conscious awareness, it is processed by our short-term or working memory. Working memory is very limited, but allows us to manipulate and process information. It is limited in both duration and capacity. The duration of working memory is about 18 seconds, but can be extended by repeating or rehearsing information over and over again. The capacity of working memory is about 7 items. In fact, we refer to it as the rule of 7 plus or minus 2. Most humans can maintain 7 items in working memory. As an example, as I read off a series of numbers, try to keep them in mind and then write them down when I say go. So I'll say 2, 4, 1, go. And then you'll write the numbers down. Write down the numbers only when I say go. I'm going to give you about 8 sequences, so you'll need a pen and paper for this. Okay. 9, 2, 5, go. 8, 6, 4, 2, go. 3, 7, 6, 5, 4, go. 6, 2, 7, 4, 1, 8, go. 0, 4, 0, 1, 4, 7, 3, go. 1, 9, 2, 2, 3, 5, 3, 0, go. 4, 8, 6, 8, 5, 4, 3, 3, 2, go. 2, 5, 3, 1, 9, 7, 1, 7, 6, 8, go. So let's see how you did. Most people start to have trouble remembering the numbers after about 7 digits. If you can get to 9 digits, that's tremendous. In fact, an interesting phenomenon occurs after we exceed our short-term memory capacity. We tend to remember only those items that we heard first and those we heard most recently. This is called the serial position effect. Typically, the recency effect is stronger in the short term. Of those items we recall the last ones best immediately after they are presented. In the long term, the primacy effect is strongest. After a delay or a change in attention, we recall the first items better. They seem to stick with us for longer. We can improve recall by changing or improving the way in which we encode information. Remember, encoding is the process by which we move information from short-term into long-term memory. We can talk about this process at 2 levels. The first is shallow processing or maintenance rehearsal. This involves simply repeating the material over and over again. This will work, but it's not efficient or effective in the long run. So one might memorize Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy by reading aloud the first line, and then the first and second line, and then the first, second, and third line, and then the first, second, third, fourth line, and so on, and in this way memorize the 35-line monologue. But after reciting it in front of the class or on stage, it will probably fade from memory fairly quickly. A better way to do this is through deep processing or elaborative rehearsal. In this manner, we associate new information with existing knowledge, understanding the meaning behind the words, realizing that when Hamlet asks, for who would fardels bear, but to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us bear the ills we have and fly to others we know not of. What he is really saying is that we suffer through life and continue to choose to live, in this case only because of the fear of what might happen after death. By understanding this, and attaching Hamlet's words to our own existing knowledge and experience, there is a greater chance that we will be able to recall those words in the distant future. Mnemonic devices are another way that we can aid recall. Again, this is shallow recall in that mnemonics help us remember but not necessarily understand information. Acronyms are a great mnemonic device. Roy G. Biv helps us to recall the numbers or the colors of the rainbow, but it does not help us explain why we perceive those particular colors. Another very effective mnemonic device is the method of loci, by which a person can remember a great deal of information by mentally placing it in certain locations. So if you have to remember a list of terms, for example, mentally place those terms in specific rooms in your house. If you need to memorize the presidents of the United States in order, You can mentally picture George Washington sitting in your bedroom. And then out in the hallway is John Adams, and then in the bathroom is Thomas Jefferson. Sitting on the stairs is James Madison, and James Monroe is by the front door, and John Quincy Adams is in the kitchen cooking pancakes. Then when you need to recall these names, you can mentally walk through your house from your bedroom to the kitchen, picturing the people you encounter along the way. Of course, just memorizing these names doesn't teach you anything about history, but it might help you pass the history class. Regardless of how we do it, eventually some of the information passes from short-term memory into long-term memory. So if we think about our three types of memory, sensory, short-term, and long-term, in terms of capacity and duration, we get this model. Sensory memory has a huge capacity. Everything that we see, hear, feel, smell, taste right now. But it only lasts for a very brief period of time, a few seconds or less. Short-term memory is some subset of that information, about 7 items or so, and lasts for about 18 seconds or longer if rehearsed, at which point it must either fade or pass into long-term memory. The information that is properly encoded into long-term memory is then some subset of what we used in working memory, but can last for extensive amounts of time, years or decades. No doubt you can remember specific events that occurred during your early childhood. Can you remember your kindergarten teacher, or falling off your bike, or your first sled riding experience? All of these probably happened to you more than a decade ago, but seem very clear in your mind. This is our long-term memory. And again, we can break long-term memory down into 3 types: episodic, semantic, and procedural. Episodic memory is your memory of events or episodes in your life. This can be what you had for breakfast this morning, or it can be your first day of elementary school. Semantic memory is your memory of facts and meaning, the first 5 presidents, for example. And procedural is your memory of how to do things. For example, you may remember how to play chess even if you can't remember who taught you or how you learned. We can also talk about long-term memory in terms of explicit and implicit memory. Explicit or declarative memory is that which we can declare or talk about. You can tell me about the time your mother sat down with you and explained the rules of chess. You may also be able to talk about several other specific incidences of playing chess. The fact that you got better at playing chess over time is a function of your implicit memory. You cannot tell me in specific terms exactly when or how you got better at this task. You may be able to say you got better through practice and by playing a lot, but you have no explicit memory of each stage of improvement. You just got better. This is implicit or non-declarative memory.